Welcome to Photo 143, Intro to Digital Photography. What I'm going to talk about today is going to be the basic functionality of our DSLR cameras. So DSLR stands for Digital Single Lens Reflex Camera. And I know that all of you are using your own cameras, and so every camera is going to be just slightly different. But the things I'm going to cover today should be pretty general and cover all cameras that we're going to be using. That being said, it's all cameras that have manual exposure functionality to them. What we're really looking for is the ability to manually adjust the exposure on our cameras in order to control everything that's going on. So with that being said, any camera, any DSLR camera with manual exposure settings will be usable for this class, and the things that I'm going to talk about today will apply to that camera in some way, shape, or form. Your camera may be slightly different. The verbiage may be slightly different. The menus may be slightly different. Some things will work just slightly different, but all of the functionality should be there somewhere. It's just a matter of figuring out exactly where it is. So when I talk about some of these things, if it doesn't exactly pertain to your camera, then you need to either look up in the manual of your camera where that might be, or contact me so that we can figure it out. There's not a lot of the settings that we're really going to be dealing with. We're going to be kind of getting into the really basic main functions of it. As a matter of fact, the things that we're going to learn would even transfer over to an SLR, which is just a single lens film camera, and we will be covering things that will be usable if you shoot film as well. So really this is the basics of photography. We're just doing it with a digital camera, which adds just that extra element of learning how the menus and things work in the camera as well. So this is the Rebel T5. This is a Canon digital single lens reflex camera. It's a pretty basic version of it, and so it's a good one to demo on because it doesn't have a whole lot of extras. So it should be similar to any of the cameras that you guys have, which is it's a body. It has a shutter button here. It has some sort of dial to make adjustments to the exposure. It's got this lens mount on the front. Inside of that lens mount, there is this little mirror. Behind the mirror is the shutter. Behind the shutter is your sensor, sort of how it works. When you put the lens on the camera, the image goes through the lens, reflects off the mirror up into a prism that's inside of here, and back out through the viewfinder on the back of the camera, which lets you see the image directly through the lens. When you take the picture, then the reflex part of the camera works, where the mirror goes up, the shutter opens, the image is exposed, the shutter closes, the mirror comes back down, and you can see through your camera again. The lenses are removable, as you can obviously see here. The lens is off the camera. On a Canon, there's two designations for the lenses. There's the red designation, which is the regular EF lens, and there's the white square designation, which is the EFS, or the smaller sensor lens. Whichever mark your lens has on it, you would line it up with the appropriate mark on the camera and then turn the lens clockwise to lock it into the camera body. To unlock it or remove it from the camera body, you would push this button on the side, rotate the lens counterclockwise, and remove the lens off the camera. Now, Nikon, I believe you put the lens on the camera rotating counterclockwise, and you take the lens off the camera rotating clockwise. And there should be a similar lock button somewhere on the front of the camera to unlock the lens. So the top of the camera has this larger dial, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit, but that lets you select your mode. It has your power button. It has a little button to pop up the flash. I'm going to strongly suggest you don't use the pop-up flash on the camera. For this class, we're going to do everything with sunlight or natural light, so you won't need the flash at all. It has a dial here that lets you make adjustments to the exposure, and then it has the shutter button on the front. So in order to see your exposure, you would push, or to autofocus, which we'll all talk about later, you would push the shutter button down halfway, and that will activate the camera and kind of get it to do all the things that you want to see. And then you would push it all the way to take the photo. On the back of the camera, we have a few things. there's this button up here on the Canons, and I'm sure that other cameras have it in some way. If you're using a mirrorless, then it's probably not there because you're always seeing it. But this button is what's called Live View, and when we push that, it brings a live image up on the screen of what the camera is seeing through the lens. That way you can look at the screen instead of looking through the viewfinder. There's also this button, which we'll talk about in a little bit as well, which is the AV button. When you push this button on the Canon and spin the wheel over here, it allows you to change the aperture value. Normally this wheel would just change the shutter value. So when you push and hold that with your thumb, that will let you change the aperture value as well. One more thing I want to point out on the back of the Canon cameras, and some of the other cameras may have it as well, is this little dial up here in the upper right of the viewfinder. This is what's called the diopter. Now, if you wear glasses and are nearsighted or farsighted, you could adjust that diopter, and what you would see through the viewfinder would be clear without your glasses. Why I point it out is that it doesn't lock. It can move at any point. You can see that there's sort of a larger, smoother section there, and it's lined up with this little T that's in there. That means there's no adjustment on the diopter. I point it out because if this spins, when you look through the lens, nothing may be in focus. It may all be out of focus, and so you would have to readjust the diopter to get it back into place. We also have a button on the back here, which is ISO, which will let us set our ISO, and we'll talk about that in the future as well. So you're going to need to put an SD card into your camera. On the Rebel T5, it goes in where the battery compartment is. On some cameras, there may be another slot right here to the side that opens up that lets the card go in. When you put your card in, there is a diagram on the flap on just about every camera that I've ever seen, and it shows there's a sort of a clipped corner on the SD card, and it shows that clipped corner. So you would put the SD card in that way and push it all the way in until it locks into place, and then you would push it again and it would pop out to this point where you can grab it to take it out of the camera. There's a few settings in the menus that we really want to talk about. We went over these in class, but I'm just going to sort of briefly talk about them again. The first one that we want to talk about is our image quality. So we have in most cameras, we have a number of image qualities that we can choose from. Those range from the type of file that it records, to the amount of detail that it leaves in that file, to the size in pixels of that file. And so for the purposes of the beginning of our class, what we want to work with in our image quality is a large, fine JPEG. We're shooting JPEG images, which means that we're going to have actual image files when they come out of the camera. All the settings in the camera are going to be applied to that image. The image will be ready to go and ready to show. We don't have to do anything to it afterwards except rename it when we turn it in. The fine detail means it's not going to lose a lot of detail in the image. JPEG compresses the image, and it's what's called lossy compression. In other words, it loses information in order to save space in the file. When we put it on this fine, which in the Canon is this smooth curve, coarse would be sort of a chunky curve. It would look like stair steps instead of a curve. When we put it in fine mode, then we keep as much detail as possible in our image. And the large JPEG is an image size that'll be big enough for us to do what we need to do with our images going forward in the class. At some point in the class, we'll be working with RAW files, which captures just the raw data off of the chip and allows us to make adjustments and manipulations to it in the software afterwards. But for now, put your image quality on something that is equivalent to this large, fine detail. The next thing that I just want to point out on the Canons is that this release shutter without card is by default enabled, which means that if there is no card in your camera will still take pictures, and it'll sometimes act and feel like there is a card in there, but it's not recording to anything. One of the things that I like to do is make sure that I change that to be disabled, so that if there's no card in the camera will not take a picture. There are a lot of other settings, and most of them are not necessary to change or personal preference. Like It'll beep when the autofocus is done. If you don't like it beeping, you can disable the beep. There's things like that. Again, download your manual and kind of look through those, or bring those questions to class and we can answer them in class so that everybody can kind of hear that answer. The next thing I want to talk about is formatting your card. If you check out a camera from the department, the card may have someone else's images on it. If you borrow a camera from someone, the card may have someone else's images on it. When you're done taking pictures for your assignment, your card may have other images on it. And you may want to get rid of those images so that you can take new images and move forward. There is in the blue menus, so I kind of didn't talk about it, but the red menus are the functionality of taking a picture, like the settings for taking your picture, for actually using the camera as a camera. The blue is our playback menus, and the gold are sort of the settings that set up the device, the camera itself, not taking the pictures, but all of the things around it, sort of the system level things. So in these blue menus, there's a menu function that says erase images, and that would allow you to go through and individually erase images one by one. But Format Card will do a very different function, which is to erase everything on the card or reformat it as if it was a new card. And so you would select Format Card and you'd hit the Set button on the back, and then you would bring up this Format Card menu. And your camera may or may not have this low-level format, which is just a little bit more formatting. Not really necessary for what we're doing, unless you're maybe having problems with your card, and then you may want to low-level format it. The other thing that I want to point out is only format your card in the camera you're going to be using it in. The camera needs to be able to communicate with that card. It needs to be able to write the images and do all of the things and utilize that card in its best possible way. And so we want the formatting to happen on that camera so that it formats it exactly the way it knows how to use it, and will have the best possible outcome when using it. So you would select OK to format it, and you'd say format it, it'll erase all the images. As we said in class, if you format your card and you didn't mean to, it doesn't necessarily mean that the images are all lost. What it means is that it's erased the directory on the card so that the camera can now use it like it is an empty card, but all your images are still there. And there is software that's available to rebuild that directory and rescue your images if necessary. That software costs a little bit of money, and it takes a lot of time for it to recover those images. So if it's just a couple of images that you accidentally erased and you're standing there and you can just reshoot them, best to just reshoot them. If it was a big sort of detailed shoot and you can't reshoot it, then it might be worth trying to recover it. So format your card when you know that you have your images all on your computer, and even when you have them backed up once they're on your computer. Then you can format it and you'll have a fresh card and be ready to kind of move on. So now that we're kind of ready to shoot, we've got our camera set up, we're shooting large JPEGs, we've formatted our card so we're all ready to go. Here we can put the lens onto the camera, and now we have sort of the whole setup. Your lens will have a button on it or a switch that says AF or MF, autofocus or manual focus. This lens also happens to have a stabilizer on it, which will let you get a little bit more longer exposures without any motion. The stabilizer means there's an element inside the lens that kind of moves to counteract any movement of the camera. We mentioned in class that the slowest you may want to shoot handheld is a 60th of a second, and I know that may not make any sense to you at this point, but at some point that'll all kind of click in. If you're going to shoot slower than a 60th of a second, the image stabilizer could help you out. For this class, I want you to shoot things or take photos of things in the sunlight. So you really shouldn't be much slower than a 60th of a second because it should be bright and nice outside. The lens goes on the camera. If you need to focus on the Canon, this front element, this sort of rubber ring on the front here is the focus, that little ring. This larger ring is the zoom on the lens, which will zoom us from a wide-angle lens of 18 to a slightly telephoto lens of 55, and with a marking of 35, which is about the normal focal length of the lens, right there in the middle of the lens itself. So as you'd zoom that, it'd either show you more of your scene or less of your scene. Sorry, and the dial on the top is where we're going to set our mode and how we're going to photograph. And there's all of these little icons and scenes and things that go on over here. Those are sort of preset modes that you can play around with and try. We're not going to use those for the class. We're going to stay in this sort of bracketed area over here, which we call the creative zone modes, which we're going to deal with, and that's where we're going to do all of our exposure. So on that dial, we're going to stay in this bracketed area. Now, this is where it could vary a little bit from Nikon and Sony cameras, if that's what you're using. But there should be some variation of these on your camera, at least of 2 of these, if not all 4 of them. So there's 4 modes that we're really going to be utilizing, and honestly, the goal is to really get into one of these modes, which is manual. Manual exposure lets us make all of the decisions and set everything on the camera. Program mode means we make a couple decisions and the camera makes all the other decisions. For this first assignment, you can take your pictures on program mode because we haven't talked in too much detail about exposure. But what I would say is, try out TV mode, which is shutter priority. You choose the shutter speed or how long the shutter stays open, and the camera picks the other elements in order to balance the exposure out. Or aperture priority, which you choose the aperture or the size of the opening in the lens, and the camera chooses the other things to make the exposure balance out. And then manual mode, where you choose both the shutter speed and the aperture, and you have to make sure that they balance out. I'll show you that in just a second. So these are the 4 modes that we're going to be using. On a Nikon, I think TV mode is probably called S. And on the Sonys, I think that you go into manual mode, and then there might be a way to turn on shutter or aperture via a menu. I don't know if it's always on the dial on a Sony. Again, download your manual, figure it out in your manual. It is not critical that you have shutter priority and aperture priority modes in your camera. What is important or necessary for this class is that your camera has manual exposure modes. So again, this is the Canon display, but I just want to kind of talk about some of the things that you're going to see when you're taking your photos. Now, this is in manual mode, which means we have the ability to make settings to all of the elements of our exposure. So we have our shutter speed that's displayed up here, and that's always displayed as a fraction of a second. If it's not a fraction of a second, it'll have little quote marks or 2 tick marks next to it, and that means full seconds. So sometimes this will be displayed as 1/1000th of a second, but it may just say 1000. And that 1000 without the tick marks, without the quotes, implies that it's a fraction or 1/1000th of a second. We then have our f-stop next to it, which is a decimal number. And that number represents the size of the opening in your lens. And we'll talk more about what that can do to your images at a later date. The next thing that we have is our ISO. So one more thing about f-stop is the lower the number is, the larger the opening is. So the lower the number, the more light it's letting in. The higher the number, the smaller the opening is. And it means the less light it's letting in. So if you're letting in more light, then this speed can be faster, right? If we let in more light, we can let it in for less time. If we let in less light, we're probably going to have to let it in for more time in order to balance it out. The third thing that we have is ISO. ISO is how sensitive your camera is to light. The lower the number, the less sensitive it is to light, or the more light you're going to need to take the photo. The higher the number, the more sensitive it is to light, or the less light you will need to take the photo. By default, your camera is probably set to auto ISO, which means the camera will automatically adjust this number in order to make these 2 numbers work together. So for this assignment, this is a good chance to for your first assignment, it's a good chance to take it off of auto and put it on manual and adjust things and see what happens and see if you can get a decent exposure. So how do you know if you're going to get a decent exposure with manual mode? We use this meter at the bottom, and this meter will also be visible through the viewfinder of your camera. When you push the button down halfway, the meter will activate, and this little mark in the bottom, this little tick mark, will come up and it will float between -3 and +3 to let you know whether your exposure is balanced at 0. So if your exposure is down here, let's say it's at -3 and that little mark is flashing. That means it's somewhere beyond -3, somewhere way out over here. And so you would have to adjust these numbers, one of these 3 numbers up here, in order to try to bring that in. So what that means at -3 is that it's underexposed. Underexposed means there's not enough light. And so in order to bring that back, we would either have to increase our shutter speed. So from 1,000th, I would go to maybe 1/125th of a second, which is going to be a longer shutter speed, and that may bring that mark back up. Or I may want to go to a lower f-stop, which will give me a larger opening or let more light in, and that may bring that up. So if I let more light in, it's going to come closer to 0. Or I may want to change my ISO and make my camera more sensitive to light. As I make it more sensitive to light, it may bring that tick mark closer to 0. So some balance of those 3 is going to bring this little mark up to 0. If it's on the plus side, then that means that my image is overexposed. And overexposed means I have too much light. So that could mean my ISO is too high and I need to lower it to make it less sensitive to light. Or my f-stop is too wide open and I may need to stop it down, going to a higher number to let less light in. Or my shutter speed may be too slow and I need to speed it up to let light in for less time. One of those 3 things is going to bring our balance back down. So if you're shooting on manual mode, you're going to be adjusting these up here. ISO is the last one that I ever adjust. I usually set it on 100 and leave it there and try to get everything to happen in shutter speed and f-stop. But you're trying to get it down to this 0 mark to balance out the exposure. If you shoot in aperture mode, or for this example, it's highlighted already. Let's say you're in shutter priority mode and you've set it to 1,000th of a second. You push the button down halfway. You have an ISO of 200. The camera's going to automatically find this balance and say you need to be at f9.0, and it will set that for you. If you chose f9.0 at ISO 200 and push the button, the camera may balance out and say, we need to be at 1,000th of a second to make this work. So that would be aperture priority. Shutter priority, you pick the shutter. Aperture priority, you pick the aperture. And the camera picks the other element to make it balance. There's some settings in here that are how your image looks and our white balance, and we're going to talk about those at some point. One shot is our autofocus, so the autofocus will happen every time we push the button to take a shot. This rectangle on the Canon means that your drive mode is in single image mode. As you push the button, it takes 1 photo. This is our metering mode, and we'll talk about those later in the class as well. There's our settings for our image quality, our battery level, and our number of frames that are left. So that's kind of the basics of the camera. I know it's sort of a quick run through it, but it should be enough for you to kind of get the camera in your hands and start taking some pictures. And that's really all we're looking to do this first week, is just sort of pick up the camera and make some photos and kind of see what we can get. After that, we're going to have to get them off of the camera and into our computer. And so we're going to need some storage for that, and we're going to need to have some way to get that memory card into our computer. So here's your SD card. No matter what, if it's your own camera or the school's camera, you're going to have to buy an SD card. They're not very expensive. SanDisk is a great brand. Lexar is a great brand. Buy a name brand and you'll be fine. 32 gigs will probably be more than enough space. I don't know if you can find them much smaller than that anymore. But you don't need to spend a whole lot on a really large storage of it, because you're going to take those images off and put them onto your computer. This little device here, this little card reader, will let you get the memory card, goes into this SD slot right here, and then this plugs into your computer, and that will allow you to sort of transfer the images from your card into your computer. Your computer might have this slot built into the side, which is great. That means you don't need this adapter. There is also a way to plug your camera in directly, but it's a very slow method of transferring. These little SD card readers are like $5, and so it's worth getting one because it'll transfer the images much quicker. The next thing we're going to need is somewhere to store it. Now, whether you're using your own computer or the school's computer, I recommend getting some sort of external storage so that you can keep your images. Well, if you're using the school's computer, you can keep your images on your own device and not on the school's computer. You do not want to store your images on the school's computer for a number of reasons. One is, if something happens to that computer, they may replace it or reformat it, and that would mean all your images would be lost. Or two, someone else could log into it and gain access to your images. Both of those scenarios are scenarios that I personally don't want to have happen, and I would imagine you wouldn't want to have happen either. So you want to get external storage, and you can do it with a little flash drive. Flash drive will work great. 64 gigs should probably be enough. Again, storage is super inexpensive now. I know you can buy like a terabyte drive in a little flash drive, and it's still not very expensive. So depending on how many images you anticipate taking, you might want to get a larger flash drive. What I would say is if you think you're going to do much more than say 64 or 128 gigs of storage on a flash drive, then it's probably time to step up to a hard drive. So this is a hard drive, and they make them as SSD, which is solid state, or they make them as spinners, which is a little spinning disk inside of there. Either way will work fine. This drive will hold far more than the flash drive, and may be quicker to access. So because it kind of has sort of a larger footprint and more circuitry inside to work with. So this would just plug into the computer, and then you could store all your images on that. As we move forward and talk about file formatting and how we put our files on, all of that will work fine on an external drive. The external drive is portable, which means it can go from computer to computer. You could use it on any computer. Your images will all be there, and your Lightroom catalog will be there. And the Lightroom catalog will work on any computer with Lightroom. The next thing that I recommend on this is, if you can, buy 2 of whatever external storage you get so that you can put your images onto one and then back them up onto another. You should have a backup of all your images. You should keep your images in at least 2 places so that if something happens to this drive, whether it's a failure of the drive or you lose it, you have a backup. You have a second set of everything. So we will continually talk about that during class as well, is the idea of backing up and keeping multiple copies of your files. So that's kind of the quick rundown of sort of how we get set up with our cameras and how we get ready to take our photos. There will be more videos and more things that talk about getting your photos off of your card and into the computer. And we will get to that as we work through that first assignment. If you have any questions or thoughts on this, please send me a message via Canvas.